So I met someone at one of my kids' activities the other day, and it was the first time we'd had a little conversation, and I thought that there was a chance that we could be friends. I really liked her, and I had her phone number because of all the things that our kids are involved in together, and so I jumped out there. I took a risk, and I sent her a text message and said, "Hey, it's Angie. I really enjoyed our conversation today. I'm wondering if sometime you'd like to go get a cup of coffee or maybe a glass of wine, or just sometime we could just go and hang out." And then as I was looking at my phone, I looked down at my phone and all I could see were these three dots. These dots that was telling me that she was on the other side of her phone somewhere and she was reading it. But then the dots, they went away and then they came back and then they were away and then they came back. So I thought, what is she thinking? All of these things. And then they just went away. She never, ever texted me back. Has this happened to any of you? She ghosted me. That is what my kids would say. She just left me completely hanging. And it's like the worst feeling in the world. I mean, she could have said something like, thanks for asking, but I'm super busy. I mean, I would have understood what that kind of meant. But she read it. I could tell she read it from the three little dots, but then she didn't reply. So then I, of course, got into my big overthinking head and I started thinking like, oh my gosh, did I offend her? Oh my gosh, should I have not put myself out there like that? Oh my gosh, did I say something wrong? Or does she not want to hang out with me maybe because I'm a pastor? Maybe she thinks hanging out with a pastor is going to feel more like confession or like judgment or something. Or maybe it's not my job. Maybe it's just me. Maybe she thinks that I'm like weird and awkward. I mean, which I am, I understand. But maybe she just doesn't want to hang out with me. Maybe she just doesn't like me. Let's be honest. Every relationship, whether we're initiating it or we've been in it for a long, long, long time, every relationship requires risk. They require you to take a risk to go and form these relationships. It requires a risk to stay in these relationships. It requires a risk to have conversations. It requires a risk to put yourself out there. We're in our final week of our sermon series called Relationship Reset. We've been taking 3 weeks this month to look at the relationships that we have in our lives. We started off the first week with the relationship that we have with ourselves. And then just last week, we talked about our marriage, our partnership, those romantic relationships that we're involved in. And today we're going to look at the relationships that we have with other people. People like your kids or people like your mother-in-law or people that you work around or people that you maybe want to get to know a little bit better, your boss or your friends. And when it comes to these questions, these relationships, the big question that we're going to ask together today is, what are you willing to risk? What are you willing to risk? I mean, when we think about taking risks, for so many of us, when we think of risks, we start to think of things like this. We start to think of skydiving or maybe bungee jumping, or maybe we start thinking of cave diving as these kind of great, big, huge risks we take in our lives. But I actually think that our relationships with other people in our lives is probably more risky than any of these things, more risky than skydiving or bungee jumping or cave diving. And it's because the risk, it's a lot more personal. It's a lot more intimate and vulnerable and ordinary and messy. It is really hard. The definition of risk is this. Risk is an action that exposes you to the possibility of injury or loss. Sure, when you skydive or bungee jump or cave dive, you put your physical body at risk. I mean, you could die. I looked it up. The odds of you dying in a skydiving accident are only 0.0006%. Only 1 in 167,000 jumpers jump out and they die. I mean, you could die, let's be honest. So there is some risk, but there are actually some things that I think are worse than dying. In relationships, the risk is emotional. It's even spiritual, you might say, because it's part of being human. And as human beings, we are biologically predisposed for connection, for community, for care, and for camaraderie. We can't help it. This is how we are hardwired. Every one of us has this desire to be fully seen and known and belong. This is part of who we are created as humans, who we are created as people. This is why we're born into families. We're born into this connection, community, care, and camaraderie. And this is why we go and we look for purpose, and we look for friends, and we look for meaningful work in our lives. When we take risks in our relationship, even more than we take physical risks, we find ourselves exposed to the possibility of injury or loss of the things that matter the most to us here in this life. After my divorce almost 20 years ago, I was never, ever, 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 ever going to put myself out there again. I mean, even think about that phrase for just a second. Put myself out there. That phrase even indicates exposure or possible doom. After my divorce, I wasn't ever going to date another human being again because I had been hurt on such a deep, deep, painful, emotional level that I would have preferred to actually be in physical pain. The hurt was so much that I couldn't imagine ever opening my heart to another person that wasn't my children or my parents. I couldn't imagine putting myself out there again because I didn't know if I could handle the pain of another rejection. We see lifelong partners all the time that die within 6 months of each other. Researchers Christakis and Elworth found that within 3 months of the time that one's long-term partner dies, the other one will likely follow up to 30 to 90%. My friends, we can die of a broken heart at a higher rate than we can die of skydiving or cliff jumping. A broken heart can crush us because it's so vulnerable. Relationships, they require risk. So what's a relationship in your life that has asked a lot of you? Was it a relationship that was hard, or one that you weren't sure exactly how to navigate? Or was there a relationship in your life that just feels too big, too vulnerable, too exposed for you to even want to do anything about it? We all take risks in relationships, risks like being a middle schooler and inviting the new kid to come sit at your table, or risking the friendships you have at your table to go and invite that new kid in middle school, or telling your kids something that makes you uncomfortable, or listening to your kids talk about things that make you uncomfortable. It's a risk losing your spouse or loving again after losing your spouse. It's a risk getting pregnant after a miscarriage, or telling your partner that you're not quite ready to try again. It's a risk to choose to forgive someone that has hurt you, or to admit that you're just not ready to forgive them. Or maybe the risk is telling your friends and family that you need help with an addiction that's been controlling your life secretly. Or it's going to a social gathering knowing that you've got that addiction under control, but that temptation is going to be at that party. Or maybe it's a risk crossing political aisles and coming to a mutual agreement. Or maybe it's a risk standing alone, looking for justice, trying to fight against, even though the people around you don't believe the same thing as you. Or maybe you take a risk living into your true self, or you fear that you'll be rejected by your friends or your family. And maybe it's a risk just even asking for help. Or maybe the risk is caring for a loved one who's going through some difficult cancer treatments. Or it could be telling your loved one that you're done with the difficult cancer treatments. Or maybe the risk is telling your boss about the problems you see in the office workplace. Or maybe the risk is listening to your employee tell you about the problems that they see in the workplace. Or maybe it's you're guiding your loved one as they begin to slowly forget you because of dementia, or choosing to move them into a memory care unit. Maybe the risk is having this difficult conversation with someone that you've been avoiding, or it's picking up the phone when they call. All relationships require risk. And it's hard because life is hard. And yet for so much of us, we have so much stuff going on in our lives that we're afraid to actually put ourselves out there. Instead, we want to just keep ourselves like in here in this nice little weighted blanket of our things and our relationships, things that we know and we can control, so that we can limit our exposure, so we can limit the conflict that we experience, so we don't disappoint others. We try and keep ourselves nice and protected and safe and comfortable. And we get paralyzed in our relationships. Now, friends, I'm going to take a risk here and tell you something that you probably don't want to hear. But following Jesus requires risk. is what the entirety of the gospel is all about. Taking a risk for both yourself and for others in following Jesus through this life. There's nothing safe about it at all. God wants to pull you out of your comfort zone and to help you walk into hard conversations, help you to move straight into conflict, to open you up to what's going on in other people's lives around you. To be seen and to see others, and to be known and to know others, to be loved and to love others. It's this kind of dangerous vulnerability, this kind of beautiful resistance, this kind of holy authenticity that God invites us into. The Bible is full of relational risk takers. There's the story of these friends who take their sick friend and then they take him up to the roof and they lower him down so that maybe, just maybe, Jesus can heal him. Or the story of the woman who had been hemorrhaging and sick for 12 years. The woman who crossed cultural boundaries just to reach out and touch the edge of Jesus' cloak so that she could hopefully be healed. Or the story of Zacchaeus, the tax collector who cheated everyone out of everything. But then after an encounter with Jesus, he went and he repaid everyone back. I mean, can you imagine those conversations that he had to have with everyone that he cheated? Or the stories of the disciples who encountered this Jesus and they want to have this relationship with him. So they leave everything. They risk everything. So here is my question. What are you willing to risk? How do we go and face the fears that get in the way of our relationships? How do we reset our relationships? I want to get us really practical here with our time left today. And I want to teach out some strategies that we can use to take risks in our relationships. The first risk that we can do is just to listen. Dr. Gary Chapman, who wrote the book 5 Love Languages, he often talks about in relationships how we end up hanging out with people who have very different communication styles than we do. He calls them in his books, he calls them either the babbling brooks or the Dead Sea. Now, the babbling brook is someone who will just keep a conversation going, someone who's good at asking questions and telling stories. But then the Dead Sea is a person that's content to just be sitting there and listening. You see, the Dead Sea, it's this body of water in Israel where rivers flow into it, but nothing flows out. All right, so which ones of you are babbling brooks and which ones of you are Dead Sea? I know that this isn't going to surprise you at all, but I am a verbal processor. I am absolutely a babbling brook in my relationships. I need to talk out the whole day and to work through things out loud and to ask big questions about all the things that are going on in my life. Now, 2 of my children, they're the same way. They're similar to me. They are babbling brooks. They have to process all of the things that life gives us out loud. But then 2 of my children, they're more like the Dead Sea. They'll just take it in on themselves, just like their dad, my husband, Ryan. They're content with just sitting there and listening. You see, the truth is, either we're a babbling brook or we're the Dead Sea. We are influenced by our personality, but we're not controlled by it. Now, it's 2-part. It's recognizing our natural tendency and then being able to shift so that we can listen or share with the other. Knowing that I have one kid that'll get in the car after school and tell me all about their day at school, and another kid where I have to intentionally be quiet in order to listen to them share. It's realizing that when Ryan and I are out on a date night, I will take my time to do all of my babbling brooking, and then I have to stop and pull back so I can hear the things that are going on in his life too. You see, both babbling brooks and Dead Seas, they deserve and long to be seen, heard, fully known, and understood and loved. It just means that some of us have to hold back, and some of us have to speak up. Listen to what's going on in the people that you love's life, because everybody's got stuff, whether they're willing to share it or not. The second thing is to lean in. To lean in to relationships. I mean, how many of us hate conflict? How many of us hate hard conversations because they're so uncomfortable? They're the worst. I mean, many of us grew up in homes where conflict was either handled by avoidance or by yelling. It was like one extreme or the other. So we haven't experienced people modeling doing conflict well. Instead, we just see people walking either on eggshells, trying to avoid it, or they're pushing each other's buttons, trying to elevate that argument. One person always getting their way and others not. Proverbs 20 says it like this: "Is the mark of a good character to avert quarrels, but fools love to pick fights." Did any of you have one of these kind of things when you were growing up? My brother and I did. It's one of these little pop punch bag things. But the one my brother and I had growing up was kind of a creepy clown. Or maybe you've seen it in the movie Kung Fu Panda, where he pops and punches this punching bag that is designed to come right back at him. The same works when we're talking about our words and actions with others. When you throw out anger, anger comes right back at you. When you throw out harsh words come right back at you. When you throw out criticism comes right back at you. When you push out all of your emotions, those emotions, they come right back out at you. When we look at Jesus in the Bible, most of the teaching that Jesus did, most of the things that Jesus talks about is how we treat other people in our lives. Jesus teaches us how we treat our friends, how we treat our neighbors, how we treat the least, the last, the lost, and the lowest, how we treat people that we don't even like. When Jesus was talking about his enemies, he talked about them like this: "It was said, love your neighbors and hate your enemies, but I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you." Or when Jesus was about to be betrayed by his friend Judas, when he was about to be completely sold out, you know what Jesus did? He washed Judas's feet. I mean, can you imagine washing the feet of someone who was about to betray you? Or when Jesus was arrested on his way going to the cross, he was arrested by Roman soldiers, and his friend Peter got all indignant and decided to cut off one of those soldiers' ears. And Jesus bent down, picked up this man's ear and said, "No more of this." And he touched and healed the man's ear. Jesus went and healed the same person that was arresting him and taking him towards the cross. Or when Jesus was hanging there on the cross, ready to die, he looked at the people that put him there. He looked at all of us and he said, "Forgive them, Father, for they do not know what they are doing." What we push out matters. How we react in this world matters. How we choose to throw those punches or if we pull those punches back. So how do we lean into hard conversations? Paul in the book of Ephesians says what we do is we speak the truth in love. You got to start there. You got to love first in order to be able to lean in. You got to love in order to speak truth. And this is why love in this part is just so very important. In order to have these hard conversations, in order to navigate conflict, in order to talk to the person that you care about, you have to lean in with love. Now I'm going to get real practical here for you today. What about those really hard conversations? How do we lean in with love there? I'm going to give you a formula to help you start those tough conversations. The formula looks like this: I feel blank when you blank because blank, I need blank. Here's an example. Instead of saying, "Oh my gosh, you really need to stop being so mean," you could try saying, "You know what? I feel frustrated when you lash out because I love you and I need my feelings considered." Instead of saying, "Oh my gosh, you always leave your dishes in the sink," you could say instead, "I feel used when you leave your dishes because I like it clean. I need for you to put them in the dishwasher." Or instead of saying, "Pastor, that sermon was awful," instead, you could use that formula and say, "I feel annoyed when you teach practical tips because I just want to yell at people. Instead, I need you to stop." Guys, we can lean in with love. And the last risk that we can take on behalf of the others is just that. It's to love. It's the biggest risk of all. You see, loving people can be the hardest thing that we're ever going to do. It can be hard loving yourself, let alone other people. To put yourself out there, to open yourself up, to be vulnerable, to say what you need, to listen to other people's pain, and then to share your pain as well. Loving is hard. Jesus said, "Love your neighbor as yourself." That means loving your annoying neighbor and your atheist neighbor. That means loving your conservative neighbor and your progressive neighbor. That means loving your gay neighbor and your straight neighbor, or loving your Latino neighbor and your white neighbor. That means loving your neighbor who doesn't text you back, and loving your chatty neighbor or your quiet neighbor. Loving your neighbor who is hard to love. We love. Back to our big question today. What are you willing to risk? What are you willing to risk in order to reset your relationships? What are you willing to risk for the sake of others? Can you imagine if just this week we all just took one brave risk step? We took off our weighted blanket of comfort and we went out there to reset our relationships. One step in reaching out, in texting, or one step to leaning in to a hard conversation, or pulling back punches when we feel like we need to throw them. One step to speaking up or to listening more. One risk in one relationship. Friends, you've got this because God has got you. Amen.
Let the King of my heart be the mountain where I run, the fountain I drink from. Oh, he is my song. Let the King of my heart be the shadow where I hide, the ransom for my life. Oh, he is my song. You are good, good. Oh, 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 let the King of my heart be the fire inside my veins, the anchor in the waves. Oh, he is my song. Let the King of my heart be the fire inside my veins, the echo of my days. Oh, he is my song. You are good, good. Oh, you are good, good. Oh, you are good, good. Oh, you are good, good.
You're never gonna let me down. 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 You are good, good. Oh, you are good, good. Oh, you are good, good. Oh, you are good, good. Oh.
When the night is holding on to me, God is holding on. When the night is holding on to me, God is holding on.
Will you please join me now in praying the prayer that our Lord taught us? Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. Hey, you guys, I can't wait for you to take a risk this week. And one of the risks I want to invite you into taking is to join one of our Connect groups. You can do this so easily by going to our website and click on the button that says Connect Groups. They're small groups of people who are doing life together. Take a risk. We want you to be part of that. We're going to close our time together with a time of generosity. There are 4 ways that you can give, and they're on your screen. The first is that you can go to our website, calvaryalex.org, and click on the button that says Give. The second is that you can use our Venmo handle, which is on your screen. The third is that you can write a check and mail it to the church at 605 Douglas Street, Alexandria, Minnesota, 56308. And the fourth is that you can call the church with the number on your screen, and we'll help you figure it all out. Hey, go take a risk, everybody.